Picture this. It's March 1943, deep in Berlin. The whole city is buzzing with victory talk, but deep inside the WWII headquarters, the nerve center for German spies, sat a man known quietly as the conscience of Germany. This was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, a guy who had spent decades watching entire empires crash and burn. He's sitting there in his dim, smoke-stained office, and he's holding something that makes all those years of spying feel utterly irrelevant. It was a secret report, and it detailed an American factory named Willow Run. Now listen to this claim, because it sounds absolutely insane. This single plant was supposedly spitting out a giant 4-engine bomber every single hour. It screamed Allied propaganda. It was too audacious, too fast to be real. But the worst part? Canaris knew his sources. The numbers were horrifyingly consistent, and his finger traced a column that mattered most. Projected output, labor force, engine production. He realized this wasn't fantasy or a rumor. If Willow Run was real, the implications weren't just bad, they were utterly catastrophic for the Third Reich. Forget tanks and guns for a second. Canaris saw the terrifying truth. The real decisive weapon wasn't a massive Panzer VI. It was the assembly line. A whole new kind of war was emerging, fought not on the muddy Eastern Front, but in giant, humming factories. This was the critical front line Germany was totally unprepared for. So, when he dropped this bombshell report onto his staff, the room went dead silent. Then came the scoffing. Impossible, some whispered. Irrelevant. We already own the skies, Admiral. They looked at the numbers, but they just couldn't compute. But Canaris knew the score. Victory wasn't going to the fanatic who screamed the loudest. It was going to the most brutally efficient production machine. And right now, efficiency had been weaponized, and it was sitting squarely in Michigan. Meanwhile, outside his window, Berlin was thrumming with arrogant confidence. The papers were screaming about victory in Russia. Factories were spitting out Messerschmitts and new Panzer IVs. And the Fuhrer was promising 1,000 years of German domination. But deep inside that shadowy intelligence service, one man stared straight into the future and didn't see glory. He saw the end of the Reich written in American blueprints and raw steel. Canaris hadn't survived the absolute viper pit of Nazi politics by believing the hype. He knew better than to trust appearances. Canaris wasn't impressed by parades or chest-thumping speeches. He was the old guard, the guy who trusted cold, hard data, not the Fuhrer's fancy world. While everyone else was popping champagne corks over German conquests, Canaris was buried alive in intercepted cables, deciphered trade manifests, and industrial surveys. Why? Because he knew the real threat wasn't on the Russian front. It was across the Atlantic. The U.S., safe from bombs and swimming in endless resources, was quietly constructing something monstrous, something vast beyond imagination. His spies, operating out of neutral hubs like Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain, started sending back whispers. A Swedish engineer claimed they were building bomber wings with the speed and precision of a car assembly line. A diplomat in Lisbon mentioned a conveyor belt so long it literally dwarfed a battleship. Every single coded message screamed the same address, Willow Run, Michigan. The whole concept sounded absurd. Ford Motor Company, the guys who built the clunky old Model T, they were now churning out massive heavy bombers. These things weren't simple toys. We're talking over 1 million parts per plane, from tiny spark plugs to complex Norden bomb sights, oxygen masks, and miles of hydraulic lines. Think about it. A single bomber needed over 1 million pieces. Everything from a tiny spark plug to the ultra-complex Norden bomb sight. How in the world do you crank out something that complicated at the speed of a Model T rolling off the line? That was the sick genius of Henry Ford. They didn't build bombers one by one. They sliced the whole manufacturing process up into thousands of small, mindless, repeatable tasks, each performed by a single worker trained only for that step. It was industry stripped bare, repetition, surgical precision, and terrifying scale. For the Allies, this was brilliant ingenuity. But for Canaris, this was absolute existential doom. He slammed his findings onto paper and tagged the document urgent for Berlin, screaming a warning. If Willow Run hit peak capacity, they could swamp the entire German Luftwaffe in less than 12 months. But Canaris knew the knife edge he was walking. In a regime that literally worshipped ideology, logic wasn't just wrong, it was heresy. And when the whole system is built on a mountain of lies, telling the truth, that's treason. So, what happened when this terrifying, factual report hit the desks of the Reich's top brass? Laughter. Literal, booming laughter. Hermann Göring, the big boss of the Luftwaffe, just theatrically waved the papers away with utter contempt. Göring just scoffed. Americans? Please. They make refrigerators and razor blades. They don't build bombers. His aides roared with approval, and just like that, the most important military intelligence report of the war was dismissed before the ink even dried. But that laughter was paper thin, right? Deep down, they were terrified of one thing, admitting the enemy had finally stolen their crown jewel, German efficiency. The Reich still saw war like a historical epic. It was about will, about German blood and destiny. Factories, manpower, logistics, those were secondary to ideology. They truly believed the sheer guts and spirit of the German soldier could overcome any industrial disadvantage. Even Albert Speer, the guy running their entire arms machine, admitted later that he was stunned by the data. He wrote after the war that if those numbers were even half true, Germany was doomed the moment the first machine switched on at Willow Run. But who was going to tell Hitler that? You don't question victory in that regime. That's called defeatism. Suggesting America could outbuild Germany was simply unthinkable. So the report was buried, and Canaris's name, it was quietly added to a growing list of men they needed to watch. So Canaris was now on the growing list of men they kept a very close eye on. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, the officers were still hitting the smoky cafes, clinking glasses to victories that had vanished months ago. If you watch the propaganda reels, Germany was absolutely crushing it. Triumphant columns, fresh tanks, and pilots with permanent smiles. But if you were one of the poor souls stuck in the back rooms of the Abwehr, running the actual numbers again and again, those figures were terrifying. They could crunch those results all night, but the answer was always the same. This wasn't about guts and glory anymore. This was about cold, hard industrial capacity, metal, oil, and sheer scale. And that capacity? Germany just didn't have it. This entire war had quietly moved overseas, and the scale of the American response was something the Nazis simply couldn't comprehend. Because thousands of miles away, on the dead-flat farmlands of Michigan, the impossible wasn't just happening. It was becoming the biggest building on the planet. This was the Willow Run bomber plant, masterminded by Albert Kahn and bankrolled by Henry Ford. 67 acres of manufacturing floor, all under one colossal roof. It was so vast the workers literally joked about needing bicycles just to get to their station. And check this out. To avoid paying property tax to two different counties, they curved the assembly line 90 degrees right in the middle of the factory floor, a literal tax turn that became an engineering marvel, just to keep the bombers moving. Ford's legendary assembly line exploded back to life. The B-24 Liberator was being built in stages. Fuselage and wings clack joined in a perfect, thunderous rhythm. Giant, tireless cranes then swooped down, lowering the massive engines into their slots. By the middle of 1944, this place was absolutely teeming. 42,000 workers filled the floor. Forget the old factory stereotype. One-third of them were women, the real-life Rosa the Riveters, taking on jobs nobody thought they could handle. Thousands more were African Americans who had migrated north, putting their lives on hold to join the war effort. Farmers, teachers, and housewives, side by side, worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The noise was insane, a deafening, mechanical heartbeat that never ceased. The air was thick, smelling of hot oil, sliced metal, and the sharp tang of ozone. But here's the kicker, the impossible result. Every 63 minutes, not hours, minutes, a brand new bomber rolled out of a hangar under its own power, ready for flight. Think about that comparison. German factories needed weeks to finish just one. Ford himself called it mass production for freedom, and the Allies rightly labeled it the arsenal of democracy. For Hermann Göring, watching from Berlin, this industrial tsunami was proof that his worst nightmare had finally come to life. Canary knew every new bomber was another nail in the coffin. Why? Because Ford was just cranking them out. In barely a year, Willow Run built more aircraft than the entire German Air Force, the mighty Luftwaffe, could ever hope to replace, and there was absolutely nothing the Reich could do to stop the flood. By 1944, the game was fundamentally over. The skies above Europe literally changed color. They weren't blue and white anymore. They were black with endless, massive formations of four-engine behemoths rising up from England and Italy. When you heard that low, heavy rumble of those engines, it wasn't just noise. It was a sound of inevitability. The proof arrived in February 1944 during something terrifyingly named Operation Big Week. This was brutal. For 6 straight days, thousands of Willow Run bombers pummeled the industrial heart of the Reich. We're talking entire factory towns like Regensburg, Leipzig, and Gotha just vanishing under firestorms. Assembly lines were completely pulverized, and their crucial synthetic fuel plants burned for months. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to fight back, but their losses were staggering. Hundreds of planes, and worse, hundreds of their best, irreplaceable pilots were just gone in a single week. Inside the corridors of Berlin, panic was a wildfire. Hitler, now completely desperate, wasn't asking for reinforcements. He was screaming for miracles. He needed the jet. He needed the rocket. Hitler was screaming for the miracle weapons, the jets, the rockets, anything to stop the bleeding. But here's the kicker. Even if those things worked, Germany was totally out of gas and raw materials. Admiral Canary, watching this whole train wreck, wasn't surprised. He had warned them when they could have fixed it, but they laughed. Now, the bitter truth was undeniable. They weren't losing because of bad generals or tactics. They were losing because of a spreadsheet. They were defeated by arithmetic, because America simply built more stuff than their delusional empire ever could. Remember how the Nazis mocked America's capacity? Well, when they finally bothered to look up, the sky was blacked out by those same inferior planes. Their once proud factories lay silent, ruins buried under the weight of their own disbelief. Sadly, the man who saw the end coming wouldn't live to see the cleanup. After the failed July 20th bomb plot against Hitler, the Gestapo found Canary's secret diaries, proving his opposition. He was immediately arrested, given a fast, secret trial, and in April 1945, just weeks before the war ended, he was executed at Flossenburg concentration camp. They didn't even give him a clean death. They strangled him with a piece of piano wire right as he Allied. Canary's warnings were silenced forever, strangled by that terrible wire. But it didn't matter. Weeks later, the whole nightmare was finally over, and when historians look back, they realize this war wasn't won by a brilliant general or a secret weapon. It was won in a ledger book. It was pure, brutal arithmetic. Just look at the scoreboard. The Allies had cranked out 300,000 aircraft. Germany? They barely scraped together a third of that number. And get this. One single factory, Willow Run, built nearly 7,000 massive Liberator bombers. That's more planes than the entire operational German Air Force had ready to fight that year. Eventually, Willow Run just returned to making Ford cars, humming along like nothing ever happened. But its true legacy runs deeper than steel and rivets. It proved that freedom's chaos could always outbuild tyranny's sterile order. That's why history remembers Canary as the spy who saw the scoreboard too early, and Willow Run as a factory that ended the war before the generals even realized it. Because in the end, the Reich wasn't doomed by a bomb or a bullet. It was doomed by the stubborn, suicidal refusal to believe in facts. And facts, unlike empires, never die.